I'm going to hand it over to you now, Leon, and melt into the background. I'll speak to you again later towards the end for questions. So have fun.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Yep. I see some people joining as it is 12:30 p.m. here in California. I don't think this will take the whole time, so I don't need to rush into it. And there should be plenty of time for questions. So hello to everyone out there in Zoom land or Hop-in land, as it were. I'm coming to you from Fullerton, California, if you happen to know where that is. So shout out to everyone in the Southern California area. So as Matthew said, I'm Leon Barnard. My talk is called Wireframing is a Team Sport. And just before we get started, I'd love if you would use the chat to write in, tell me where you're from, what your role is, and also a little bit about why you came to see this talk. And then feel free to add any questions you're coming in with, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So I would like to start with a story from my first UX job, which was quite a long time ago now. When I interviewed with the team, I was really excited because they showed me some of the designs they had created and this cool internal website with style guide and graphic assets that the developers could use. But then when I started the job, I was disappointed to find that none of the products I had seen, or none of the work I had seen was in any of their products. So this was a case of the UX team not having a seat at the table and being ignored by the product and development teams. But there was actually more to it, which I will come back to. But first, why am I talking about wireframes today? Well, shameless plug, I just wrote a book about them. Actually, it was me and my colleagues, Michael Angelis and Billy Carlson. It's called Wireframing for Everyone, and it's published by A Book Apart. And this talk is a summary of one of the chapters in it. And today is actually a very special day because it's the first day that you can pre-order it. And I'm going to give a link to that page at the end of the talk. So why did we feel the need to write a book about wireframing now? It's 2023. Doesn't everyone use Figma and design systems now? Well, maybe a lot of you do here, but I think that's still not a reason not to use wireframes. So here are 3 reasons why I think this topic is relevant in 2023. The first one is that a lot of companies are not designing like Google and Apple. They're still catching on to this whole UX thing, especially in government, enterprise, education, and then on the other end of the spectrum, small local companies building websites and internal tools. And for those companies, wireframing is really their gateway to learning about and doing UX. Second, we don't talk enough about the process of wireframing, like how to actually do it. Wireframes kind of get dumped on a lot because of their perceived limitations or whatever. But that's like saying you don't like watercolor paintings. It ignores the maker and the technique. So I hate to say it, but I think most of the complaints about wireframes are not really about wireframes themselves. It's about how they're being made and how they're being used. And most arguments against wireframing miss these points. And lastly, wireframes might not be the perfect medium for UX designers who can invest the time to become design experts, but they're perfect for PMs, business analysts, developers, marketers, etc., who need a design technique that's easy to learn and use. So I started with that story as an example of when I learned about what designing software was like in the real world. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So Agile came along and was supposed to solve all of our problems with the software development lifecycle. Short sprints, frequent releases, quick feedback, and the ability to respond to changes in priorities and market conditions. And I agree, it's certainly a lot better than the old way, but it's never really as clean or smooth as it's made out to be. And then with UX, the lure of it has always been taking a bad design and then sprinkling some UX on it to make it better, which seemed fun and frankly kind of easy, right? You didn't have to know how to write code or have an MBA or some other specific college degree to learn how to do it. Yeah, and UX is cool. It's all about ridding the world of awful websites and designing cool buttons, right? That's what we were told. Hopefully you've gotten to do some of that in your career, but certainly not what I've done in most of mine. So this image, which you've probably seen, has been around for decades, and I think it still resonates with a lot of people, maybe some of you out there. I just read an article last week complaining about a lot of the things that I mentioned in that first UX job, so I know it's still like this in places. So if you feel like it, let me know in the chat if this resonates with you or if this feels outdated where you work. But really, it's not that surprising, actually. To build a real software product takes so many people, processes, specializations. It's not something that one person can do well on their own. So how do successful products actually happen? They break down silos. They work as a team. It's not about what flavor of Agile you use or which JavaScript framework you use. It's all built on good communication and working as a team. Good teams have good players, of course, but the magic is what happens between those players. They communicate, they plan, they practice, they improvise. All this stuff that was not happening in my first UX job. The UX designers in that job were too focused on the design, just doing our part. We were part of the problem, actually. We weren't focusing enough on the process, and the other groups were doing the same thing. So here's another way of thinking about it that's maybe more like an actual software process. It's kind of like a relay race where the PM starts with the requirements, hands them off to the designer who turns them into a design spec for the developer, who then hands it off to QA. For example, you got to have fast runners, but you also have to pass that baton smoothly. That takes practice and communication. It's not enough just to do your part. Good teams work together. They think team first, and they share responsibility for the outcome. The team wins and loses together. So here's another question for you. When you talk about your team, or when someone asks you about your team, what do you imagine? What does that mean to you? So let me know in the chat whether you think your team is other UX designers at your company or the different roles that work on the same product or feature set as you. Basically, do you feel like you work in a silo or not? So feel free to share that in the chat. I'm very curious. So what does all of this have to do with wireframes? Well, as you might suspect, I'm going to try to make a case for how wireframes can help you think like and operate as a team. Using wireframes as a central part of your process can help the entire team work better. But first, let's talk about why I don't think prototypes are the right answer to this challenge. They should be, right? Lean is all about prototype and test, right? It should work. And it does work sometimes. Not all prototyping is bad. But I think that in a lot of cases, it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. Many prototypes become more like scale models. You get caught up in building something that looks and feels like the final product. That's what prototyping tools allow you to do, which is cool, but it's not always the right thing. They're not used for rapid prototyping and testing. In prototyping, you're supposed to be trying things out, learning and making changes. Scale models are great for showing off to the client, but they're not what's used along the way, and they're not what's used to actually build the thing. It's the blueprint that is. The blueprint is used for so many things. It helps the architect visualize the space, try new things. It shows the client where the rooms could go and their relative sizes. It shows the builders where to put the outlets and the water pipes. It's used by the city to make sure everything is built to code. And it's probably gone through a dozen or more iterations, unlike that expensive scale model. But it's not sexy. You don't wow the client with it. But you also can't build a house without one. So back to wireframes. Wireframes are not just low fidelity prototypes. They're not even really deliverables, or they shouldn't be at least. They're transient artifacts. They're not for the client or the customer, they're for the team. Wireframes really have two main purposes. They're a tool for ideation and communication. They're limited on purpose so that you don't try to use them as scale model prototypes. We need to start embracing that distinction between prototypes and wireframes better. My favorite thing about wireframes is that they are as comfortable with convergence as divergence. You can use them to explore ideas and also refine ideas. They're fast, so you can explore or elaborate easily, but they're also easy to understand and make changes to, so you can refine and reduce your ideas without much cost. You don't need to switch tools when you switch thinking modes, which makes it easier to go back and forth. Another reason why wireframes still matter, maybe it feels like UX has that seat at the table everywhere now, but I don't think that's true. A lot of design work is being done by non-designers still. There are tons of companies that operate with kind of a design gap where a dedicated design role is absent or not really integrated into the process. There's still a lot of people throwing designs over the wall or doing it themselves without a designer. So I hope I've convinced you that wireframes can still be a thing in 2023. So now let's look at specifically how they can be used on teams. So in addition to the benefits I mentioned earlier, wireframes have an added benefit when used across roles. They don't require any specialized skills to work with, so everyone can make and understand them, which is pretty cool. This also means that you can give your wireframes to another person and they can pick up where you left off, or they can make changes along with you. Also, since they're so rough, it feels more okay to show your work along the way and get more frequent feedback. All of this feels very agile-like and iterative, the way it's supposed to be. Another thing that often gets overlooked is their flexibility. A developer doesn't have to use or create them the same way that a designer would. Wireframes can help everyone in different ways. So let's look at some examples of that. The first thing that wireframes can do for product managers is allow them to get that idea in their head down on the screen. You can't really move past that idea until you get it out of your head. And then you can start exploring variations on that idea and even entirely new ideas. So for PMs, don't stop once you've drawn the most obvious solution that a customer or stakeholder has asked for, or after you've designed a feature just the way a competitor does it. You want to come up with multiple ideas so that you can show them to designers and developers to validate both usability and feasibility. This will also kind of get their mental wheels churning around the design. You can also show different concepts to customers or subject matter experts if possible. But you don't want to show the whole design solution. It's too early for that. You want to get as much input as possible before choosing a specific direction. And so for designers, we should really be leaning into our creativity with wireframes. Don't just take what the PMs give you and then make it look nice. See what you can do to explore their ideas more and push the boundaries. See how many ideas and variations you can come up with, quantity over quality. Enough ideas that you can get opinionated feedback on. Yes, I like this. No, this won't work. Then go back and forth between the PM and the developer, checking whether you're on track. You can kind of bridge that divide between them by showing them wireframes and then iterating until they're both feeling good about it. You can also use your UX insights to think about use cases that might have been missed or any assumptions that are being made and asking questions about them. There's a quote we use in our book from a designer named Shipra Khayan. Try not to be the designer. Instead, focus on creating space for other people to have insights, ideate, and design. You want to try to create the right conversations. That should be your focus, not delivering the perfect design artifact. And so for developers, you can use wireframes to help the designer. You can tell them what you need to know about the design, maybe propose some alternate ideas that perform the same function, but work in a more technically elegant way. You can use them to have a conversation with the designer. You can also make your own wireframe visualizations to clarify your thinking. Maybe take the front-end wireframe and draw some arrows and boxes for all the back-end connections, or sketch out the database flow using a wireframing tool. And if you happen to be acting as a designer, try to fully embody that role. Step out of your technical silo and try to think like a designer before thinking about the implementation. So that's some tips for how individual roles can use wireframes differently to optimize their work. So what can you do to make them all work better together? Remember that relay race, those handoffs are critical. You need to prepare your wireframes for handing off. Use annotations, comments, notes, whatever. But you want to make sure that the person getting the wireframe from you has the same understanding of it as you do. It's not about the design. It's not just about the design. It's also about the communication. And handing off usually means talking through those wireframes together. You should leave that conversation knowing that you're on the same page. One of the reasons that people love prototypes is that they look like the real thing. But this can be a trap. There's that old adage about Photoshop being a great way to show someone what their website will never look like. Anyway, it feels comfortable showing something that looks final. It feels safe. And it feels like something you can be proud of. Hey, look how nice this looks. And look at those cool animations. But if you're still in the middle of the design process and you do this, one of two things will happen. First, they could say, looks good to me, because it does look good. Or they could tear it apart and then you'll have to start over after putting so much effort into it. But what's harder and also better, I think, is to show in progress work. Look at how messy these wireframes are on the screen. They've got a mix of high, medium, and low fidelity. They've got comments and notes all over them. They're ugly, basically. But there's something you can bring up on a screen and have a conversation with someone around. They ask to be talked about. That's how you bring people together. So remember when I was talking about the process of wireframing and how we don't talk about it enough? Wireframing is it's not just one thing. It can be used for a variety of purposes. The first is to get what's in your head down on the page or the screen or whatever. I call this articulation. Second is generation. This is what people mostly think of when they think of wireframes. Coming up with a lot of different ideas quickly. Wireframes are great for that. Next is iteration. Use that initial batch of ideas to prompt feedback and more ideas. Throw away the ones that are bad, try to improve the ones that have potential. And then there's communication. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Show someone a wireframe and they'll immediately get what you're talking about, or at least it establishes some common footing. Finally, wireframes can be used to show stakeholders and other business people to see if you're on the right track. Is this what you had in mind? Is this something that you can build? We need to talk about these different uses of wireframes, both to show their range of uses, but also to set expectations. If I come to you with a wireframe I've created to communicate a concept to you, I may not be looking for feedback on it, except maybe what's not clear about it. So be upfront about what the wireframe is for so that you can direct the conversation around your goals. We actually came up with 10 principles of effective user interface wireframes a while ago. I'll go through them quickly here. You can read more about them on the website. We also have this cool poster graphic that you could print out, and I have a poster on my wall. The first one is demonstrate an understanding of the problem, then focus on user needs, thoroughly explore solutions, don't show more detail than necessary, functional, not fanciful, follow UI design patterns, invite discussion, incorporate ideas from others, make them easy to understand, validate with users and team members. So going back to what I said in the beginning about people complaining about wireframes, I think that people don't realize how much there actually is to know about making them. Once you start thinking about them the right way, their value becomes a lot more clear. So I encourage you to think about these principles the next time you work with wireframes. Forget the scale model, right? So this is what a great wireframe looks like in my mind, even though it's not for a user interface. It's got some illustrations, but they're not very detailed. There's a bunch of notes and arrows and some technical information. It's very easy to read. It's kind of like an architect's blueprint. Keep it simple, stupid. Forget about how nice it looks. Focus on what it communicates. And don't forget, the goal is the understanding. Be clear and concise. Don't do more than needed. So a quick recap here about a process for wireframing. Be explicit about handoffs. Practice passing that baton. Don't wait until the race starts. Get comfortable with wireframes as transitional artifacts, not deliverables. Set up expectations that this is okay. Encourage others to do it too. Adapt your wireframes to each role and phase of the process. Learn how to use wireframes better through practice and best practices. Work on getting better at wireframing. And keep it simple. Do only enough to move things forward. The end product is the goal, not the wireframe. Lastly, getting buy-in and agreement can be a big adjustment. So I'll leave you with a few tips to help make it go more smoothly. One of the biggest challenges of working this way is that this makes the designer's role very different. Instead of the designer being the designer, their job is to facilitate the design. The entire team becomes designers, or more accurately, they all share responsibility for it. So who does the design? Well, everybody participates in this model. When everybody participates, that also means that everybody shares ownership of it, which is a big adjustment for a lot of people. The responsibility of delivering a great product falls on everyone's shoulders. You can't play the blame game. You got to think about setting others up for success. Lastly, wireframes can be tough to pitch to clients or executives. You can throw together some kind of fancy prototype if you need to, or you can show them wireframes and introduce them properly. Tell them that the goal is to deliver the best possible product. not, to make it look pretty in this phase, and walk them through the user's experience. So they really try to see it from the user's perspective. Tell the story while you're showing the wireframes. Give them some credit. They'll get it. So what else? Well, if there is a conflict about the direction of the design, decide in advance how you're going to solve it. Agree on what the most important goals are for the project. Is it usability? Is it marketability? Is it time to market? Whatever it is, that should be used as the deciding factor. It shouldn't just be the loudest person in the room. You can also go back to the top and say, which of these designs solves the problem statement best? Also, you should also always be thinking about how you can build connection with your team. You don't have to be best friends, but try to find things in common and ways to build team connection. So to summarize all of this, despite being well-meaning and good people and having great players, a lot of software organizations don't have enough of a team mindset to cross the silos separating them. And wireframes can help with that. But it's important that you don't just use them as low-fidelity prototypes. Wireframes themselves are an artifact, but wireframing is a process. It's a way of thinking where everyone works together. Wireframes can also be used by different roles and in different ways. They're not just one thing. It's ultimately about the people, the team. So you have to have a team mindset to make it work. It's never just about the tools. And finally, if you take one thing away from this talk, I hope it's a new perspective on wireframes. If we think about them differently, then it becomes a lot more clear how powerful and useful they actually are. I think they're a great tool to help us be more creative, which is something that's really needed in UX right now. So finally, remember that you can pre-order my book, Wireframing for Everyone, today. That short URL is shown on the screen, or you can go to abookapart.com/products/wireframing-for-everyone, which is why there's the short URL. And then also check out the learning section of the Balsamiq website, which is at balsamiq.com/learn for more about those 10 principles and tons of other things about wireframing. So I definitely kind of sped through that. Hopefully it wasn't too fast. Thank you everyone for listening. We have plenty of time for questions.
Oh, thanks, Leon. You've certainly made me think about wireframes and wireframing in a different way, came across as very much a communication device, a conversation starter, which is great. And actually, the way you talked about wireframes, it sounds like they can mean a lot of different things. I think of wireframes being sort of diagrams, but you were saying, well, just importantly, they would have annotations, they'll have notes. So it's the definition, I guess, of a wireframe is fairly broad, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that I like to use the word low fidelity. It's something outside of the UX industry that is maybe not a very good term to use because most people don't know what that is, but within UX, it's pretty well understood. So I think, maybe the more important distinction is between low fidelity and high fidelity. And so anything that you're going to do in low fidelity that kind of, has the same wireframing, like I said, is a process. It's more of kind of a philosophy. So anything that embodies that kind of low fidelity, rough and ready, be able to toss it out, is in the same sphere as wireframes. And I endorse anything that fits into that.
By the way, Leon, I just found that if you Google wireframe, then Balsamiq's definition of wireframe is the featured snippet right at the top of the search results.
Oh, right.
Kudos to you. We've got a few questions coming in. Adrian had a question, which I'll read out and see if you can answer it. I found wireframes and prototypes in tandem help product owners understand the concept where dialogue becomes more robust and the client becomes more interested. Is this counterproductive as I can do it quickly?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think really one of the things I was saying is it's really about how you use them. And that applies to prototypes too. I think prototypes are often misused. And so if you're able to, you want to think about what is that point of diminishing returns, so you don't want to over wireframe. You don't want to add too much detail to your wireframe because you're probably not getting good returns on investment there. And I think the same applies to prototypes. So what is something, a time to consider prototyping is what is something that's useful that would take more time to do in a wireframe or can't be done in a prototype, in a wireframe that can be done in a prototype. So I think it really comes down to kind of judicious use of them and using them wisely. And I love the idea of using them in tandem rather than just thinking, oh, I have this powerful design tool that can make a wireframe and a prototype, but it's like something that gives you so much power and so many options, it's often hard to stop in the low fidelity phase. So I think it's not necessarily counterproductive, but really think about, okay, who am I doing this work for? What is the value of it?
Great, thanks. And then Jean had a question, the last question at the bottom of the window. We get business people to look at wireframes, but how can you get developers interested in them? That's interesting because you were talking about developers using them, weren't you, as a way of communicating to designers? But I guess there are some developers who aren't that interested and need to be sold on the idea of wireframes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's great that you're getting business people to look at them. I think that can often be the toughest sell. One of my favorite things to do with developers is if you have some kind of a design system or a pattern library, have a conversation or have some internal document where you're kind of mapping wireframe controls to design system components so that you can deliver them a wireframe, and you can even maybe label, oh, these buttons are default primary buttons. This button is secondary large or something like that. So you don't need to put in the extra effort of styling everything in your prototype or your wireframe to look like the finished product when the developers are going to just use their code snippets and do that on their end of things. So you can give them a wireframe, and if you're able to add enough context there, they can just kind of mentally say, oh, okay, I know which JavaScript components those are, and I'm going to implement that, which is kind of a nice thing to do. But I think it really takes a lot of upfront conversation. It's like, it kind of goes back to practicing that handoff thing. So you have a meeting about how are we going to work together? What information do you need? Another thing that I think a lot of people don't think of is that some information, and this goes back to the question about prototypes too, some information is just easier to convey by text. So you can do a wireframe, and then you could do some kind of, text specification document or a conversation. What information is easier to convey through writing or, through talking to somebody. So maybe you give them a wireframe and then you give them, some CSS styles or something like that. So find out what information they like to receive, and also what's maybe frustrating in the artifacts you do give them, where maybe they say, oh, in the prototype, I don't understand if you mean this style or this one or what you mean. So try to really figure out what's the best way to deliver the information they need. And so I think it all starts with a conversation.
Yeah. Matthew's question is asking the same question I would have asked, actually, is what are the preferred wireframing tools, especially given the fact that you said the wireframes are perfect for non-specialist designers. So what kind of tools are these people comfortable with using?
So I work for Balsamiq, which makes a wireframing tool. So I'm very biased, obviously, but we do address this a little bit in the book. I think some things to look for are tools that are limited in some way. So I think it can be hard to use a powerful prototyping tool or tool like Figma to do wireframes, especially for people who are new to design, because they're going to see all the cool things that they can do, and they're going to want to do all those things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good to have a dedicated wireframing tool that is kind of limited in functionality on purpose. So you can also think, okay, well, maybe I can use a whiteboarding or a diagramming tool. And those can be good because they don't allow you to do some of the fancy things that prototyping tools do. But then you're stuck in this situation where you're kind of doing UI design in a tool that wasn't optimized for that. So like when I first started out, I was using PowerPoint for some of my designs, or then, people used Visio. And with at least like tools like Visio and some of these other ones, you can get some wireframe templates or something. So the two criteria I have are, I think it should be very simple, limited on purpose, but also have some user interface controls built in, or that you can add on, that you can just drag and drop onto the canvas. So you're not only limited to circles and squares and trying to draw a user interface from that when you're suddenly trying to draw a radio button component or a drop down, and you have to like go in and put the little arrow inside the other box. So it's easy if there's just a lot of those controls built in, you can just drag in.
Yeah. And Kyle has a question about what role should copy have in wireframes. Do you use it as a tool to communicate intent, guidelines, etc., or try to instead focus on the layout?
I think that's an excellent question. We at Balsamiq, we've started in the last few years hearing more and more about copywriters and marketing people who are using wireframes because it allows them to start designing with the copy first. So there's this idea of like content first. So you don't want to just design your layout in boxes and then it looks nice, but then when you go to actually put in the content, it gets all messed up. So we find a lot of copywriters and writers like to wireframe because it gives them a little bit of an idea of the relative size and spacing and layout of things. So we actually have a good article on our site about using content modeling to do your writing. So you kind of start at a higher level with these kind of blocks, and then to kind of get an idea for the layout, and then you do another iteration where you bring in a little bit more sample or real content. So I think it's good to kind of work in phases where you start at a very high level and then you kind of go a little bit more specific. So again, going back to different types of wireframes. So use them, kind of do maybe different types of wireframes if you're thinking about layout versus content. But I think doing some wireframes where you're starting with content can be a really good use case for them.
Great, thank you for that. Nancy's question is, how can the process of wireframing help overcome silos of ownership and lack of consensus across teams? What does that look like?
Well, I think, a lot of what I talked about in this talk was about that. I think the biggest thing that it can do is bringing kind of a level of informality to your team. So if you bring somebody a wireframe that is, incomplete or is kind of fuzzy, and you say to them, hey, here's kind of what I'm thinking. That invites people into the conversation rather than going off to your desk for a week and then coming back with something and saying, okay, here you go, here's the design. Then, that's not a conversation, that's not a dialogue. But if you generate a bunch of ideas, you give them 3 ideas or 5 ideas and say, hey, what do you think of these? Then, on one level, you're inviting them into the conversation, but what's also happening is that you're getting buy-in. Then they're saying, hey, I told him that I think this one is really good. And so now I'm kind of bought into this, or I gave him an idea, or I gave them an idea, and then they went and they iterated on it, and now we have this. And so you're kind of subconsciously building this idea that you're all working on it together, that you're all sharing it. But it really happens with a lot of face-to-face interaction and kind of leading with informality or even vulnerability. If you say, hey, I don't really, I have some ideas about this part, but this part over here, like, what do you think? I'm not really sure. The best way to make friends is to be vulnerable. So instead of, UX designers, we kind of have a chip on our shoulder a little bit, because especially the older ones, for a long time, it's like we really had to justify that we were needed and important. So we felt like we always had to show things that were good. If you showed a wireframe and they're like, what, are we paying you money to do this? But I think it can be really good to say, hey, this stuff I feel good about, but I don't really know about this. And you do, you're the expert, elevate them a little bit, and then really try to invite them in the conversation. But that has to happen with face-to-face conversations. Whatever tool or technique you use alone, that's not going to do it. It has to be a conversation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. There's one thing you said during your presentation, which I'm going to ask you to elaborate on a little bit, because I thought it sounded interesting. You said wireframes are as comfortable with convergence as divergence. Can you remind me what you meant by that?
Sure. So I think that divergence is something that's really kind of missing in a lot of UX these days. We talk about it when you learn about it. We talk about how you start with an idea and that leads you to another idea and it kind of branches off and there's this burst of creativity and you have all these ideas and then you go in another direction and the same thing happens. And so, we talk about, and even in that idea of agile or lean, you want to come up with all kinds of good ideas and test them. So, you have to, if you want to have a good product starts with a lot of ideas, and a lot of ideas has to start with something that makes those ideas easy to create. So if you're kind of limited in the amount of detail that you can put into something, and if it feels comfortable to kind of start over, like it does often in a wireframing tool, that encourages you to try to kind of explore and branch off and try new things rather than saying like, ooh, this looks done. I want to go and I want to finish all these pixels, So having something that naturally encourages you or makes you feel comfortable coming up with lots of ideas first. And then, I think in our nature, we do kind of want to, when you see a bunch of ideas, then you're like, you come back to it. And then, there's that idea of going for a walk or taking a shower, or, your mind is working on it. And so you go back to your wireframes the next day or in the afternoon after lunch. And then you're like, oh, I see how I can revise this, or, oh, I thought about it and I realized that, that first one, that's a terrible idea, so you can start switching modes to that reductive mode of, okay, let's make some of these ideas better. And then let's just throw out some of these other ideas. So you're kind of in that divergent mindset where you're narrowing down a little bit. And we have this image in our book that I think it's not entirely linear. It's more like these alternating processes of converging and diverging, and those slowly, gradually come together towards the final idea. It's not just like a bunch of ideas and then narrow down. It's kind of like going back and forth because new ideas always spawn new ideas and new thoughts. And so having something that allows you to switch back and forth easily between those modes, I think is useful.
I think you've sold me on the idea of wireframing there. Yeah. Thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. I learned a lot and it was entertaining and very informative. Thank you.
Good. I just want to take a quick check at some of these comments earlier.
Yeah, do. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad that some of you are using wireframes. And yes, I think a lot of, I've been attending some of the other talks and I've definitely been hearing a lot of these themes of design maturity and how can we get people on board, and we have all these systems and nobody's working on the same thing. So I think I do think it's timely, and I do think it's I think these are some good questions about that. Yes, please, if you have any other questions, let me know in here. I think my LinkedIn info is in there. We'll just drop in one link to the book if you're interested. It has this topic and it talks about a lot of other things about wireframes as well. But I really enjoyed this time, and I hope.
Well, thank you, Leon. And we did indeed. We certainly did. And enjoy the rest of the conference over the next 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, I'll be around if anybody wants to reach out.
Okay, great. Okay, see you again.
Thanks.
Bye.